Welcome, everyone, to tonight's constitutional conversation, where our principal guest is Professor Amanda Tyler from across the Bay in the law school that shall remain nameless. She has been at that institution since what I think about 2012. I have first encountered her work in connection with her book and earlier articles on habeas corpus. Her book is entitled Habeas Corpus in Wartime, From the Tower of London to Guantanamo Bay, and it's both a great read and I think the best treatment of that important subject. But tonight she's coming in her capacity as the co-author with the late lamented Honorable Ruth Bader Ginsburg of a book entitled Justice, Thou Shalt Pursue, A Life's Work Fighting for a More Perfect Union. So this tonight is in honor of Justice Ginsburg as much as it is of Amanda herself. Amanda clerked for Justice Ginsburg after getting a JD from Harvard Law School and a further degree in public policy from Stanford. Joining us and joining Amanda is our very own Ann Joseph O'Connell, who is known to at least the students among us and faculty among us and as one of our very best teachers of administrative law and constitutional law. She's been on this with the Constitutional Law Center on programs in the past. She used to teach at the institution across the Bay before we stole her, so she and Amanda were colleagues. Stealing Anne was probably the best theft since the, I don't even know what the example would be, the Hope Diamond. But in any event, Anne also clerked for Justice Ginsburg and will be engaged in a conversation, leading the conversation with Amanda. So I'm going to turn it over now to Anne for this conversation. Thanks to both of you for being here.
Thanks so much, Michael, and thanks to all who've joined us. So we're going to take the first half hour or so in a conversation about this wonderful book co-written by the late Justice Ginsburg and Professor Tyler. And then the last part of the discussion will be questions from you. So look into the chat, there's more information there, and we'll take questions from the audience. So I thought I would start by asking Professor Tyler to explain to our viewers / listeners, I'm never quite sure what the term is in the Zoom world, how Justice, Thou Shalt Pursue, the book came about.
I love to tell this story because it's a great story about our former boss and how loyal she was to her friends and how important it was to her to use her platform to lift up other people and to honor the women who came before her. So that's a big part of the story of how our book comes into being. The short version is it's an outgrowth of Justice Ginsburg's visit to UC Berkeley in the fall of 2019, when she came to give the first annual Herma Hill Kay Memorial Lecture. So Herma is a big part of the story. Herma had been the second woman on the Berkeley Law faculty and our first woman dean, longtime colleague of yours. I overlapped with her for several years, and even just in that short time came to view her as a dear friend and mentor. When she passed away in 2017, the law school created this memorial lecture series, and there's no one who was better suited to give the first lecture to kick it off. There was no one other than Justice Ginsburg. And I like to say that when I would call and invite her to come and do events at the various law schools where I've taught, I was always not totally confident whether I would get a yes. But when I called to invite her to do this, I was 100% confident that I would get a yes. I knew she would come because she loved Herma so much. And they had a relationship going back 50 plus years. Together with another co-author, they had written the very first casebook on sex discrimination in the law in the early 1970s, effectively founding the field as an academic matter. And so that, that history bound them together, and they remained very, very close friends throughout their lives. So Justice Ginsburg, of course, said, yes, I will come. And she suggested that we make it a conversation. And I was only too happy to do that and to get to have the opportunity to work with her on crafting the narrative, or I should say crafting the questions that I would ask her and the coverage of our conversation. And then to get to sit down with her when she visited. Now, she initially was supposed to come in January of 2019, but doctors discovered lung cancer in December of 2018. And so she had to have surgery on her left lung, and that made it impossible for her to come. But I remember, and this is going to become a recurrent theme with her, it was really hard to talk her into postponing. She was very hesitant, and it was only 2 or 3 weeks before the scheduled original event that she finally relented and said, okay, we can postpone. She was so determined to come and honor Herma. So we rescheduled for October 2019, and she comes. Although it should be noted, she still was very much not at full speed. She was still undergoing continuing very intensive cancer treatments for her pancreatic cancer. But it was, again, just so important to her to come and honor Herma and do this event, and also to draw attention to Herma's work. So Herma had written a book as her last project that chronicled the stories of the first women law professors in this country, those who paved the way for Herma and Justice Ginsburg. And Justice Ginsburg had written the introduction to that book in 2015, but by 2019, it still was languishing. No publisher had picked it up. And in fact, a couple of publishers we knew had passed on it. So Justice Ginsburg and I were talking, and she got the idea that maybe we could turn our conversation into our own book, and we would offer it to the University of California Press, which we knew was reviewing and considering for a second time, having turned it down before, publishing Herma's book. And so what we did is we went to the press and we said, we have an idea for a book. We'd like to do it, but we'd like to offer it to you. But there's one condition. It has to be part of a series and released alongside Herma's book. And the press, to our delight, jumped at the chance. And so we began working on the book in earnest shortly after the conversation, but we knew going into the conversation that it would be an anchor for the book. So we planned it very carefully beforehand. But again, that's an example of how Justice Ginsburg was very loyal and always using her platform to lift up other persons and other voices. And I'm really pleased as I'm sitting here with you to have the 2 books over my shoulder that have released alongside each other, paving the way in our book. And it's just a special tribute to 2 extraordinary women.
I love that story. And both Herma and the Justice, they were both forces. And also they both had great senses of style. So I loved the book you wrote with the Justice, and the range of sources, right? There are speeches, there are bench statements, there are opinions, and there are some wonderful photographs. So if you've not yet looked at a copy, you should. And so I'm curious, Amanda, what your favorite part is of the book, and what do you hope that readers will take away from the book?
It's hard to pick a favorite. I could quote a line that she uses in the book, which is, that's like asking, I don't have grandchildren, but she says that's like asking me to pick my favorite grandchild when I asked her what her favorite opinion was. In this book, there are so many things that I'm really excited about. I think in real time, the opportunity to interview her and now see that captured in the book was really special, because you get to hear her tell the story of her life in her own words. And that's really neat. I have to say that I really love that we have the Moritz brief in the book, which is the very first brief that she ever filed in a gender discrimination case, and a very special one at that, because it's the one that she did with Marty. They did it together and then they argued it together, and that's never been published before. And it's a window into what she was thinking in the early 1970s as she launched on this advocacy career, and really over the course of that decade changed American society. So that's really special. But I think if I really have to pick a favorite, it's the very last installment in the book, which is an absolutely magnificent speech that she gave at a naturalization ceremony in the winter, the last winter of her life. And it's a window into every aspect of her life. It's a window into her family. She talks about her parents. She talks about being the child of an immigrant and the grandchild of immigrants. She talks about how in the land of promise that is the United States, someone from that background could rise to be on the Supreme Court. And she also talks about, very poignantly, to the newest American citizens that are her audience, how the Constitution is not something, and this is a theme of all of her life and her jurisprudence, it's not something that just belongs to the judges. She says to all of them, this is now your Constitution, and you have to take ownership of it, same as I do, and you have to work to live, to promote that more perfect union. And that's where the title, the subtitle of the book comes from. It's up to you to join in the work of building the more perfect union, which of course is a phrase taken from the preamble of the Constitution. It's the very purpose of our Constitution. So I love that. And even if you get into the details of the speech, there's so many layers to it, and there are so many wonderful parts to it. She quotes de Tocqueville, and she says, relying on him, that the greatness in America is not that we're necessarily more enlightened, but it is that we learn to address our faults and our mistakes. And that's a pretty beautiful and an extremely timely message. It's also an encapsulation of her optimism, which I think she never faltered from. Despite losing many big cases at the court, she always remained fervently optimistic that better days were ahead. And I think all of that comes through in this speech. And I would urge people that if you have the opportunity to Google it and watch it, there's a video online where you can see her giving it, and the setting, everything, it is just magnificent.
That speech was very moving. That was one of my favorite parts as well. So Professor McConnell wouldn't name that school across the bay, but let's talk about Berkeley Law and some of Justice Ginsburg's trips there. And it was because of you, Amanda, right, that the justice made several visits to Berkeley Law. And in addition to the conversation you had, she came before that, right? She came soon after you arrived. Sort of how did that come about? Like, how did you get her to come? And how is it like, right, you co-taught with her, and I'll share my story after you share yours about kind of what it's like to co-teach with the justice.
Yes, I'm smiling because I hadn't been asked about that earlier visit, and it's a great story. She came in 2013, right after Shelby County. So right as she's becoming the notorious RBG. But it all came out of, actually, we had a clerkship reunion and we went back for it. And I hadn't invited her to do anything in a few years. And I always had the view that you can't invite her too often. You have to really wait until a special occasion, and then you make the invitation, because otherwise you're asking too much of her. And so I had waited and I'd waited. And she, over the course of the prior year, which was my first year at Berkeley, we had talked a few times. And each time she had said, boy, I'd sure like to get back out to California. And I didn't realize that she was actually asking to be invited. And so we had a clerkship reunion, I think early in the summer, and I was talking with her. I got my couple of minutes. Everybody obviously loved to visit with her. And for many of us, that was the only time we would see her for a while. But I got my couple of minutes, and she put her hand on my arm and she said, Amanda, I'm starting to get offended. When are you going to invite me to Berkeley? So when she didn't want to be subtle, she could be quite direct. I said, oh my gosh, Justice, let's make it happen. And so it did. And she came to my class, and she went to your class before she did a big event, and also a lunch with the faculty that day, I think. And it was so much fun. I have so many stories actually from that visit, some that are really funny. But she came to the class, and I had had Supreme Court justices visit classes before. I used to teach in DC, where it was a lot easier to get a justice to come to class because they were just coming across town. And I had developed this habit that I would never tell my students a justice was coming. I would say, we're going to have a guest speaker on such and such day. It's very important that you be on time. You might consider dressing semi-professionally, but otherwise, I'll see you then. And I wouldn't say anything. I think the one other thing I would say is, don't be late. If you're late, don't come. And so I had said that. And they're not stupid. My students did put two and two together. They knew she was going to be on campus. They had figured out that she was coming. They were all dressed in their best suits and in their seats, 15 minutes early. But even still, when she walked in, the looks on their faces were priceless. I will never forget that. It was so special. And we did something similar to what we did that's in the book. We sat down and we had a conversation about her life and career. But we also, because it was civil procedure, and I know you were teaching civil procedure as well, we talked a lot about civil procedure, which was really fun. It had been a dream of mine to be able to co-teach a civil procedure class with her. I think I developed my own love for this subject from clerking for her and also having had a great civil procedure professor in David Shapiro at Harvard. My very favorite memory of that class, though, is we left a lot of time for the students to ask questions. And one of my students asked her, they asked the best questions, and there's so much fodder there, but the one that stands out is a student asked her, what do you do when you encounter discrimination? And she said, you think that you act like you're a kindergarten teacher, and you explain to the person exactly why what they're doing is wrong. And I loved that answer. So tell us about remember your class, because I was there and it was great.
So it was substance heavy. I think the students may have appreciated more if they were able to ask more questions, but it was cold calling. It was an intense experience, but we were discussing the Notice Pleading Restoration Act, which was a proposed statute to reinstitute the Conley standard for 12b-6 because there had been two big decisions where Justice Ginsburg had dissented, the Twombly case and the Iqbal case, that you needed a plausible claim in order to survive a motion to dismiss. And so various students were talking about how they supported the Notice Pleading Restoration Act, how the Conley standard needed to be back in place and that this was the way to do it through legislation. And the justice sat back in her chair and she paused and she said, I am not in favor of this statute. And the students were shocked because, of course, she had dissented in both of those cases. And in the first case in Twombly, she was one of only two dissenters. And she asked a question to the students and she said, you want Congress to create the rules of civil procedure. Mm-hmm. And it was an institutional point for her that she liked the Rules Committee process as a way of considering the rules and revision to the rules of civil procedure. And it was just a really wonderful moment because it wasn't what students were expecting her to say. So let's go to her later visit at Berkeley. And in your conversation with her, you talked, as one of the many subjects, about her advocacy. And indeed, the line she mentions in Frontario is part of the introduction, right, to the new Strict Scrutiny podcast. And in addition to discussing that in the conversation that's in the book also contains a speech where she discusses lessons she learned from Justice Brandeis, including a brief earlier in his career. And so I guess my question is kind of what strikes you about her and her advocacy work?
I think she was brilliant. She was, like we saw from her as a boss, she was meticulous and she was careful and she was very thoughtful. So every detail to the big picture was very well thought out. And you see that when she talks in the book about the influence of Brandeis. It's really fascinating because the Brandeis brief is filed in a case in which he's arguing that the state should be able to limit how much women work. And she views that as problematic, but she takes out of the lessons of his success strategy and ideas for how to develop her own advocacy and pursue her own advocacy. And so I think that was part of her brilliance, that she could look at a situation with which she was in disagreement, but then take out of it the wisdom that would be useful and the tools that would be useful for her. The other thing that I think was just so brilliant about how she did it was, and by it, I mean the advocacy over the 70s, is that she was very calculating in the cases that she took and in the clients that she took on. And she took on, she's known for this, this is no surprise, she took on a lot of men. And I think, you know, she received some criticism for that. But if you look at the landscape of the courts in the 1970s, certainly before Carter, there were almost no women on the courts. It's not until President Carter puts a number of women, including Justice Ginsburg, on the courts that we start to see that kind of representation. So this is somebody who said, this is my audience. I have to tell a story with which they can relate. And that story may best be told by showing how classifications based on gender in the laws can actually impact men as well as women. And the best case of all that's in the book, and she talks about it, and we have portions of the argument in there, is Weisenfeld. I think that was her all-time favorite case, because our other co-clerk, Abby Gluck, says in one of the mini documentaries about Justice Ginsburg, and I have a funny story about that, I'll come back to that. She says that it's her dream, right? This is a widower this is very tragic. His wife dies in childbirth, but the dream is, he says, I want to stay home and I want to raise my kid. And the justice was very common to say, women will not achieve full equality until men help sharing, carrying equal load in the raising of the children and the other familial obligations. And here's a man who's trying to step up, but is being denied Social Security benefits that if the tables had been turned and he had died, his wife would be able to receive. And discrimination is running in three directions in that case, because his wife had worked, she'd been a teacher. So the law is saying that her contributions to Social Security are effectively meaningless. He is a man who wants to stay home and support and be with his child until the child goes to school. And he's being told you'll get no support for that because you're a man. And then the third form of discrimination is against the kid. And this is how she gets Justice Rehnquist's vote. And she was always grateful for this. Rehnquist finally votes with her in a gender discrimination case. And that's because from his perspective, he thinks it's absolutely irrational. If you think about it from the perspective of the kid doesn't care. The kid needs a parent, and especially now that he's lost one of his parents. And so that was a great case to highlight for the audience that discrimination that's born out of a statutory scheme that actually probably had very good intentions to help give better benefits to women who might, for any number of the reasons in the 1970s, not have the skills or the means fully to support themselves. But the law, it held other people back. And she was able to do that just so masterfully, so successfully.
So maybe let's talk a bit more about gender discrimination, because actually the first time I encountered Justice Ginsburg in person and the Supreme Court from the inside, it was sort of from a distance. It was after my first year of law school, and it was June of 1996, and I was working for the general counsel of the Defense Department, who happened to be a woman, which was extraordinarily rare. And a bunch of summer law clerks from the Defense Department were sent to the court to go and hear decisions be handed down. And it happened on that day, the first time I had ever been in the building, was the day the VMI decision was issued. I started crying, actually, listening to her statement from the bench. And that statement from the bench is in the book. Because sort of the year before my first year of law school, I'd done the first year of graduate school, and I had been told, that only women failed the general examinations in the economics department. And to hear Justice Ginsburg read her bench statement was just so incredibly powerful. So I was hoping you could talk about how that case, which had this kind of immediate resonance for me, but it had a much longer history for the justice.
Yeah, I'd love to tell that story, but I have to ask you before I tell it. Did you, at that moment, did you start thinking, I want a clerk for her?
No, I never thought it was possible. And I didn't even really understand what a clerkship was. I'm very grateful to some professors at Yale who actually reached out to me to say, you know, you really should be thinking about X, you should really be thinking about Y, including clerking. Because to be honest, in my first year of law school, I just found it incredibly intimidating, and I didn't speak, and all these other people around me were speaking all the time, and they seemed so brilliant. And I thought, oh, those are the people who go and clerk for the Supreme Court. So no, it wasn't even on the radar screen.
I just asked because it must have been so incredible to be in the courtroom that day. I'm very, very envious of you, and I can imagine that it was a really overwhelming sense of excitement and pride, and just a well of emotions that day. You know, that's one of her very favorite cases, and she was so proud of it. And there are so many reasons why. There's the very common reason we give is because here she is writing for the court, citing all of these cases that she had won as an advocate. And that is so cool. There's the second reason that we mentioned in the book, which is that Justice O'Connor had been offered the opinion first. And Justice O'Connor said, no, Justice Ginsburg should have it based on her background and her work. And she was very grateful for that. We talked about this last summer, and she said, Justice O'Connor was like, she thought of her like a big sister. She had been looking out for her. She thought that was an enormously beautiful and wonderful and kind gesture. And then, you know, to your question, the thing that a lot of people don't know is that VMI really was the continuation of a case that she had handled in the 70s, and she had lost. And if you know anything about Justice Ginsburg, you know she didn't like to lose, and she never gave up. And so that's the beauty of VMI. It's the victory she finally secured. So in the 1970s, there was a case called Wertheimer versus City of Philadelphia, or School Board of Philadelphia. And the case involved a challenge brought by a girl on behalf of a class who wanted to go to Central High, which was the magnet sort of high achieving student school in Philadelphia for boys. And there was a different school for girls. And true to form, this is the 1970s, it has lesser facilities, lesser opportunities, fewer STEM classes. It's a shadow of the boy equivalent. And so she wants to go to that high school. And the district court sides with her. They win in the district court. Then it goes to the Third Circuit, and the Third Circuit reverses the district court. So now that's important, because when it gets to the Supreme Court, ultimately the court's going to divide 4-4. But a lot of things happen along the way. So Justice Ginsburg and the ACLU come in, and she is the principal author of the opening brief. But then a real difference of opinion that has been sort of brewing, if you will, erupts between the original local counsel and the ACLU team. And they have totally different visions for how this case should be framed and argued. And local counsel effectively pushes the ACLU off the case. Now, that means that local counsel writes the reply brief and argues the case. Justice Ginsburg doesn't argue the case on the heels of having argued successfully several cases and having won those cases on the very theory she would want to advance in Wertheimer. What happens, as I said, is the court divides 4-4. And when that happens, that means the lower court decision is affirmed, which means the high school stays separate with unequal facilities. And I think, one, it's a fascinating thing to wonder whether if Ginsburg had written the reply brief and argued it, she would have won. I think probably she would have, because I think she could have picked up one more vote, especially if she framed the case in the same way that she framed the other cases that she won. But she didn't win. And that case really ate at her. That was a loss that she kept carrying, and she was really upset about having lost it. And so fast forward 20 years, and she's writing for the court in VMI that the state cannot offer unequal schools with unequal opportunities to men and women. You know, the state of Virginia had proposed creating a new military academy just for females that was going to have a shadow of an endowment compared to VMI, that was not going to have the same faculty, that was not going to have the same science classes. I mean, the facts are so parallel, and much lesser facilities. And she gets to write for the court saying, no, this is not okay. The Equal Protection Clause demands that you open up the very rich opportunities and the storied history and prestige and network of VMI to all applicants. And that is effectively what she wanted back in Vorchheimer. And so she says in the book, in the conversation, that when she got VMI, Marty gave her a hard time saying, oh my gosh, you're still litigating Vorchheimer? But the beauty of it is that she won it. She won it eventually. And now VMI is the law of the land. And I think that's a really important story to keep in mind, because it's a story of perseverance and not giving up. And that was a very defining feature of her, that she just kept doing the work and she kept at it and she never got discouraged. And eventually she saw a lot of major victories as a result.
And there's a wonderful photograph in the book of at VMI with some of the women cadets. It's a very powerful picture. So before we turn to the Q&A, which Morgan is going to run, I thought I would close this part, Amanda, by just asking you, and I'll also share as well, what some of your sort of last interactions with the justice were.
Well, I was lucky enough to have quite a few with her in the last year because of the visit and then the book project. I actually, shortly before the pandemic, I flew to Washington to have dinner with her, which is completely crazy, but I'm so glad that I did that I flew literally just for an overnight. That was a really special occasion and it remains and will always be a very special memory. But then we talked and we worked together throughout the following months into August. And there are so many special memories from that, and particularly toward the end. 3 in brief. I was sending her pages and she was asking for them even when she was in the hospital. She wanted work. And this reminded me of when I clerked for her and she had cancer for the first time. She kept asking for more work when she was in the hospital. And so I kept sending her pages. And especially when she was in the hospital, her assistants would print them out and she would print out, they would print them out in triple space. I had made apparently no progress since being her clerk. She still wanted triple space and they would come back completely covered in markups. So I clearly had made no progress since being her clerk. And the worst part about this is they also printed out my cover emails. And those came back marked up with edits, which is, I'm really embarrassed to admit, but that just shows you this woman never missed a step. She was so on it still. And I apparently still have a lot of work to do. But turning to be serious, also in that, that included the draft introduction, which is under my name, but she had marked it up considerably. And I had a fair bit about Marty in there, but she suggested that we add more. And I love that because, here she was, this is August, and she was thinking about Marty and he was in her heart and in her thoughts. And I love that. I just love that. The very last conversation that we had, and I write about this in the book, was one in which when we were talking live, among many other things, she asked about my children. And she was very worried about the fact that they were going to go back to school, that they were probably going to go back to school online. And she asked, will they be able to go in person? And I said, no, they're starting school online. And she then said that she was really worried about kids everywhere who are being so profoundly impacted by the pandemic. And I keep coming back to that because it was our last conversation. And because I think it really shines a light into who she was. This is the very end of her life. And she's thinking about others. And more importantly, she's thinking about the next generation. And that was Ruth Bader Ginsburg in a nutshell.
So lovely. Yeah, the last time I saw her in person was in October of 2019 when she came to have this conversation with you and to have this speech in honor of Herma. And we went to this amazing meal in San Francisco. And although the justice, had various eating restrictions because of her treatment, she still like heartily like ate the fish that was prepared for her. And I remember clerking for her, and Marty would call chambers and like force her to go home at 9 or 10 o'clock at night. She was a total night owl because he had prepared some amazing meal from her. And it was like the meal and Marty, you know, were drawing her home. And then an experience I had more recently before she passed was one that was shared by many, was the oral argument in the Little Sisters case, but my co-clerk, Abby Gluck, and I were asked to kind of live chat the oral argument from C-SPAN, and she was in the hospital at that point in May. And just to hear her questions and the forcefulness from her hospital bed, Abby and I are both like live chatting for C-SPAN and texting a private conversation among clerks about just her strength and how inspired we were. So let's thank Amanda for this portion, and I'm gonna turn it over to Morgan to lead the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Anne. And thank you, Amanda, for being here. This is such a great book, such an important book, and we're really happy to have a chance to talk about it with our students and our community. Okay, so we'll dive into the questions from our audience. The first question on a similar tone is to say thank you to Professor Amanda Tyler for tirelessly promoting the book and continuing to talk about the justice's legacy. And this person asks if both of you could talk about personal stories about how the justice supported you.
I'll go first. How much time have you got? She was amazing to her law clerks, and it's hard to overstate how grateful I feel to her for supporting every change in my career, every move, for making time to give advice, for just I always felt like she was in my corner. And I remember in particular, one thing that really stands out above everything, but there are so many, and particularly since we're talking about career, I'll limit it to career as opposed to support in my personal and family life, which is even more extensive. But when I went on the law teaching market, I had asked her, can I list you as a reference? And she said, of course. And so I had listed her as a reference. And it's a few months now into the market, as it were. And she calls me and she says, Amanda, did you list me as a reference? And I said, well, of course, Justice. What, you think I'm stupid? Of course I listed you as a reference. And she said, well, not one school has called me about you. And I don't know what to do. Where are you still in play? And at that point, things had sort of settled down. This was after the initial meat market, as they call it, where you go to a big hotel and you have preliminary interviews. So I was now at the callback phase, and there was a list of about 5 schools that were still in play. And so I said, well, I listed them for her. And she said, send me an email, or send Linda, her assistant, an email with the school, the name of the hiring chair, and their phone number, and do it today. So we hung up, and of course I did it right away. And then I learned within an hour, she had worked her way down the list and called every one of those chairs to support me. And that gives you an idea of what I mean when I say I felt like she was always in my corner. And I think about that when I am interacting with my students. And I think about, I'm not Justice Ginsburg, but I'm a professor at UC Berkeley, and I do have a platform and I can help them. And I'm always thinking about her saying, send me that list, and picking up the phone, because I think that's a pretty great example.
Oh, and they must have been so shocked to receive the call. I remember actually in my clerkship, this is not directly relevant to the question. I'm very close to, at that time, was very close to my grandparents. And in fact, it was part of the reason I got hired on my resume at the bar.
You have to tell this story. You have to tell this story.
I said, I enjoy swimming, attending the theater, and spending time with my grandparents. And soon after I sent my applications in, I got a call from Justice Ginsburg inviting me to interview and saying that no one had ever mentioned their grandparents before. And then during the clerkship, I needed to go up and see my paternal grandparents and got permission from the justice, but we were working intently. And so the justice had a question. So she called, and my grandmother picked up the phone, and and then my grandmother, without covering the phone, right? This is, someone who had not attended college, just shouted, "Oh my goodness, Justice Ginsburg is on the telephone for you, Anne Margaret. Anne Margaret, get here immediately." And I was like, oh my gosh, like I'm, basically, a young adult at this point. But in terms of, the justice was such a booster. I didn't ask her for help. In part, I think, like you said, Amanda, you didn't want to kind of infringe on her time, but then I would hear stories about how, someone would meet her at an event and mention me, and the justice, would say all these like way too lovely things about me. And that was really important. And she would send notes. I would keep her posted about certain publications or certain moves or having kids or getting married. And there were always notes. And of course, for the big personal things in one's life, getting married, having kids, there were gifts that would come from the justice.
Those are great stories. Thank you for sharing them. On a somewhat different topic, another member of our audience assumes the title of the book must be derived from the Torah, and asks how you came about deciding to use that for the title.
When I was thinking about possible titles, I remembered that when I clerked for her, on the wall of her chambers was a piece of art that had that phrase, "Justice, justice, thou shalt pursue." And I thought that was really special. It was a tie to her faith. It was a tie to my memories of being her law clerk, and it is the perfect encapsulation, I think, of how she thought about how to live her life. In every aspect of her life, every day of it, she pursued justice. And so it was just a question of, okay, let's get this in the title, and then what else do we need to say, because that's definitely going to be it. And I'm just so pleased that that is the title. I think it's just perfect.
Another audience member asks about the Ford case. I believe they're referring to Ford Motor Company v. Montana, and asks if this person remembers correctly, this is the first CivPro case without the benefit of the justice's mastery of CivPro on the court, and is curious what you think the justice might have said about the case.
Anne, why don't you do this one, or unless you want me to?
Yeah. So the justice cared deeply about civil procedure. And I do remember at, I don't know if it was a clerk reunion or some other interaction I was having with the justice. I think it was some other interaction I was having with the justice. And the justice came up to me and grabbed my arm, and she said, "Anne, you're teaching civil procedure." And I said, "Of course, Justice, I'm teaching civil procedure." Though I should note, I haven't yet been asked to do it at Stanford. But she grabbed my arm and she said, you must promise to teach my dissent in Shady Grove, which was an Erie case. And her opinions on Erie, she had very firm views that were not always shared, right? She was not always in the majority. And her opinions could be hard going, especially for first-year law students. And I was actually a bit embarrassed at the time because I had only skimmed the opinions in Shady Grove. And so I said, "Of course, Justice, I promised to teach it." And so the next time I was teaching civil procedure, and I was like, "Well, I promised the justice I must teach her dissent in Shady Grove." And then when I was actually going through it, I was like, whoa, this is really hard stuff. But I did it. I did it for the justice. And if I were to teach a CivPro again, I would teach the Shady Grove dissent. But I think the justice would have been pleased with the outcome in Ford. That there was personal jurisdiction in the case because of Ford's connections and contacts with the foreign state. The majority doesn't leave you with much of a test in terms of like how to apply it going forward. One of my former colleagues, Amanda's current colleagues, Andrew Brott, has some really interesting thoughts about the Ford case and how it will apply going forward. But I think she would have been pleased that personal jurisdiction was found.
Yeah, I agree. I was worried when she passed away for that case, what it would mean for that case. But I think she would be very happy with the outcome. And as Anne says, it'll be, now it'll be interesting to see what it means in future cases.
That discussion segues nicely to another question about the role of the justice's dissents. Can you, both of you, talk a little bit about how she thought about the role of her dissents and perhaps which one or which few of them she thought were most important, and if any you think are most important that you'd like to talk about?
I think I'll give this to Amanda, just sort of given the role of the dissents in the book, and I might add something at the end.
She liked to say that when you write a dissent, you're writing for the future. She hated to lose, as I've said. She would always have preferred that her dissents be majority opinions. She would have much preferred to win those cases, but she never gave up. And she wrote very powerful dissents that she thought if you sat down and read them down the line, you would find compelling, and maybe they would prod a re-examination of the issues. And that's the way in which she thought about who her audience was. And so it's interesting, when we were working on the book, we decided we would include a collection of her favorite opinions, and she chose them. She said, these are the 4 that if someone reads nothing else, I want them to read these opinions from my time on the court. And 3 of them are dissents. And I think that is both a sad statement about how in the latter half of her time on the court, she lost far more than she would have liked. But I think it's also a reflection of what I was just saying, that she was writing for the future, and she wanted those dissents preserved as part of her legacy. And she wanted them to inspire people to keep waging those fights. So I think that is really important. What's really interesting to me, I went back recently and I counted up her opinions, and particularly looked at how many dissents she had published, because I was under the impression, as I think many people were, that there were more in the later years, especially after Justice Stevens left the court and she became the senior so-called liberal justice on the court. But the number, the average dissents per term was exactly the same as all the earlier years. I think it's just maybe that she was writing in more prominent cases, and particularly Shelby County really drew a huge amount of attention to her. And I think, if I can say it, we're seeing right now how important that case was and how right her dissent was, because she argued there that the Voting Rights Act preclearance procedures were critical to ensuring that everyone has a right to vote, and that we don't allow states with a history of voter discrimination license to enact provisions that will dilute the vote based on race. And unfortunately, I think with the absence of the preclearance procedures now, we're seeing that play out in real time, and we're seeing it play out in jurisdictions in particular that were covered jurisdictions. So in Georgia, for example, they could not have put in place new restrictions or new regulations on voting without having gone through the preclearance process that was done away with in Shelby County. So I think that dissent resonates as much today as it did the day she read it from the bench.
Yeah, and that links to one of the questions that we also saw from the participants about sort of how prescient her dissent was in Shelby County, and I think it was incredibly prescient. And it also created an aura about the justice that I think Amanda and I didn't experience when we were clerking for her, because she wasn't the notorious RBG when we were clerking for her. She was more recognizable than other justices, but when I was clerking for her in 2003 to 2004, she was still driving herself in this old station wagon slowly down Constitution Avenue to barely make oral arguments before 10 in the morning. I know this from personal experience because I was also a night owl, and I was passing her on the way to get to the court to make sure I arrived, just ever so slightly before the justice arrived. The other thing I'll say about dissents and the justice, because I worked on some dissents with the justice when I clerked for her, and they were on what others may have labeled kind of small bore matters. But when the justice thought the majority had gotten it wrong, even in a very low profile, ERISA type case, the justice took those dissents really seriously, and it mattered to her. And so I learned a lot from that experience.
Many commentators have talked, I think, ad nauseum about her relationship with the late Justice Scalia, and it's both widely discussed and widely praised. Can you both talk about the significance of that friendship generally and what impact it specifically had on the law?
Go ahead, Anne.
So I'll just share a story that I have shared with some others before. So the justice's birthday is also my mother's birthday, and 10 years apart. So the Ides of March. And when I was clerking for the justice, it's March 15th, I'm sitting at a desk. This is when her chambers were on the second floor of the court. And the desk I had in that period allowed me full view of everyone who entered the kind of main room of chambers. And of course, her kind of chambers were off to the side. And it was late morning, and I'm hearing someone running, and I'm hearing pounding as the person is running. And I'm hearing a voice shout, "Ruth, Ruth, my dear Ruth." And it was loud running. And in comes Justice Scalia with this huge bouquet of flowers. And I thought, ooh, should the Justice Scalia, should he really be running? And he's a little out of breath, and he has this huge bouquet of flowers. And it's, of course, for her birthday. And I just remember being sort of so struck by it. And of course, I think their friendship was not just a friendship between Justice Scalia and Justice Ginsburg, but also between the couples. And I think that Marty in particular, who was like so extroverted and just so gregarious, I think that Marty got along well with Justice Scalia. And I just think something about the four of them also worked really well.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, their families were very close. They used to have New Year's Eve together. She often, and Scalia also talked about how theirs was a friendship that was built on common ground. They loved their families. They loved the opera. They were both from New York. He was from Queens. She was from Brooklyn. They loved language. They loved the Constitution. Maybe they interpreted it a little differently. They loved their country. And I think what was central to all of that was not just that they had this common ground, but also that they had a presumption of good faith. Each other was acting in good faith. And I think that went a long way with them. The other lesson, though, I think to take, and this is really important to take out of that friendship, is what she talked about when she delivered remarks at his memorial service. She talked about how when she had circulated her majority opinion in the Be My case, he had been the lone dissenter, and he remained the lone dissenter. He gave her an early preview of his dissent before he circulated it to the other justices. And she was very grateful for that. And she talked about how with every iteration of engaging with his dissent, her majority opinion got better. And so it wasn't just that they had this common ground and this belief in each other's good faith. It was also that she actually thought that sparring with him intellectually helped her up her game, helped her improve her own arguments to shore them up and make them that much more compelling and convincing. And I like to talk about this relationship and that back and forth with my students, because I think it's a really critical skill as a lawyer. I'm sure this transcends being a lawyer, but especially being a lawyer, you need to understand the arguments on the other side so that you can explain them away and shore up your own arguments along the way.
Another question from our audience. First, they thank you both and express how touched they are by your personal experiences and that you've shared them, but ask if you could share one opinion that you didn't agree with or that caught you by surprise, especially if you've had the chance to perhaps talk about it with her.
Anne, you want to go first?
So mine's a bit unusual in that it's not an opinion when she was on the Supreme Court. It's an opinion from the DC Circuit. And so for those students on the call who've taken administrative law, they know this already. But one of the most central cases in administrative law is a case called Chevron. And it's about courts giving deference to agency interpretations of ambiguous statutes. And the court has modified it in certain ways. Justice Souter's opinion in Mead adds some procedural requirements to get a Chevron deference, that the agency typically has to have engaged in more formal procedures, things like notice and comment rulemaking, to get Chevron deference. But what many people don't realize, unless they've taken administrative law, is that the Supreme Court reversed a DC Circuit opinion in the Chevron case. And that DC Circuit opinion was written by then Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now, to her defense, there was some kind of bad precedent about attainment versus non-attainment areas under the Clean Air Act that then Judge Ginsburg felt bound by. But I definitely prefer Justice Stevens' opinion in Chevron to her opinion that was reversed in Chevron. And I did get a chance to discuss Chevron with the justice. And she was adamant, right? She was sort of adamant about how precedent had kind of bound her to the outcome. And that in subsequent years, she was, an enthusiastic applier of Chevron deference on the DC Circuit, and then, of course, on the Supreme Court.
So I have a couple of opinions that come to mind, and one is funny because I teach it to my students. It's a 9-0 civil procedure case that she wrote for the court, upholding the removal of a case from state courts when actually the jurisdiction of the federal courts did not exist at the time of removal. And there's a line in there basically that all's well that ends well. It winds up, the problem gets cured along the way. But I think that case is completely wrongly decided. It's a case called Caterpillar. And I give it to my students every year. And I say, we go through it and I say, does anybody think there's anything wrong with this decision? And I've given them all the tools to just go to town in criticizing it. And no one will do it because I clerked for Ginsburg and it's a unanimous opinion and they're brand new law students. And slowly, I extract out their criticism. And eventually they realize I actually think the opinion's wrong. And it's this great moment where they realize that you can question the Supreme Court and you can criticize even people who you admire. However, I never, ever told her about that because I was very nervous that, I never talked to her about it. I was sufficiently nervous that I might upset her or offend her. She did, however, know of my criticism of her position in the Hamdi versus Rumsfeld case. I've written extensively about executive detention, and been very critical of that decision. There was a dissent by Stevens and Scalia in that case that I think got it right. And she knew that. She knew that. And I think my hope was that if the issue ever came again, she'd maybe go back and look at my work and reconsider, but who knows?
One final question before we wrap. Just any final closing thoughts that either of you would like to share?
Go ahead, Anne.
Yeah, I'll let Amanda have the last word, but it was a huge loss, I think, for me personally. And I also lost the judge I clerked for before clerking for the justice, also this year, Judge Stephen Williams on the DC Circuit. And interestingly, right, she discusses his dissent in Shelby County, right, which is kind of close to what the majority in Shelby County came to. So it was a huge personal loss, but of course it was also just a huge loss for the nation. And of course, so many losses in this past year. So it's been a hard year for so many. But this book, I'll let Amanda kind of close, but this book really is wonderful. I mean, just from the photographs to the bench statements, to the speeches, to other aspects, in reading it sort of cover to cover this week, helped in processing that loss.
That's really nice and hard to follow up, Anne. Thank you for doing this with me. It's so, I've said this to Anne offline, it's a very special privilege to get to talk about Justice Ginsburg with fellow members of the RBG clerk family. It's really special. And thank you for having me at the center to present this. Thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us and hanging in there with us. Final thoughts. I hope that the book is an inspiration to people to keep talking about her, to keep talking about the grand life that she lived, and to keep doing the work that she was so dedicated to building a more perfect union and fighting and pursuing justice. And when I think back to, earlier Anne asked me what's my favorite part of the book. If I actually had to pick one page, it would be the page that I added at the end of an image of a little girl in a Supergirl costume who came to pay respects when the justice was lying in repose on the steps of the Supreme Court, and the little girl was saluting her. And I had to add that because that's my absolute favorite image to encapsulate everything that the justice was about and that I hope this book conveys, which is she cared deeply about the future. She was ferociously optimistic of all that we could be. And I hope that people walk away from the book feeling energized to keep doing the work. Thank you for having me.
With that, I hope you all in the audience join me for a virtual round of applause. Thank you so much, Amanda, for co-authoring this book and speaking about it with us. And thank you, Anne, for taking time to moderate a conversation with Amanda. I think this was a really wonderful talk. I'll just close by letting everyone know about the center's next event next week on Wednesday, April 7th, same place, same time, 5 o'clock p.m. We'll be discussing executive orders, what the constitutional limits of those might be, with legal scholars Michael Paulson and David Strauss. So we hope to see you there. And thank you again to Amanda and Anne. Good night, everyone.